evening. Welcome to Eretz Israel. I'm Avraham Shira. Welcome to our series on Hanukkah, Jewish Cultural Revolution. Tonight, the fourth candle of Hanukkah, and our fourth in this series, exploring what I feel are very pertinent, historical, and present matters that are in front of us as a people and as individuals as well. We are holding in an area of the historical aspect of this story where 200 to 300 years BC, the Jewish people had already been conquered and really decimated in a lot of ways by the Babylonians. And they came back from exile in Babylon. They rebuilt their temple. It was a smaller model than the original. It was less glorious, if you will. The people were still spread out in exile. And then what happened was that the nations of the world were always trading around the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin. So there was constant commerce going on the ocean side of Israel and in the desert side, and people were coming and going all the time. So there was constant international influence. And because of the way world politics worked, one king would take over another king, and then the one king that was victorious in battle, like the kings of Egypt or the kings of Greece or the kings of Syria and Babylon, were in constant conflict with each other over periods of hundreds of years. And so when any one king would get the upper hand, they would subsume, if you will, their influence over the smaller nations in the region, of which Israel was one. Israel was a tiny spot on the map then, so it seems a little bigger now, at least when you live here, in the global world, in the global community. But still, what happened was that there was a succession of kings that had influence in Israel, starting with Alexander the Great, who was probably the most famous and the most powerful of European leaders ever, and whose influence was all the way out into Asia and all the way through Europe and Africa. And he came to Israel, and what did the Jews do? Well, they didn't fight this warrior. Of course they didn't fight the warrior. He had armies that were bigger than the whole country. The estimated population there was about 120,000. And Alexander traveled with 200,000 soldiers at a time when he went on his big campaign. So, what do you do when a general like that shows up at your shores, which he did in Gaza, in Ashdod, Ashkelon? Well, you greet him with honor. You greet him with elephants and red carpets and palm fronds and all the produce of the land. And that's what they did. So Alexander was brought into the country as a welcome, powerful figure. Okay? People changed their name to Greek names. People enlisted in his army. People were looking for ways out of the little country. Sound familiar? Maybe there was a little bit of the ghetto mentality then, because Israel was Am Yishkon Levadad, right? That the Jewish people are always, the Bible said, a separate nation that would dwell apart. But not everybody wants to dwell apart. And what we see is a fantastic picture of how Hellenization, the process of Jews taking on Greek and European and African values, was also geographically mapped and influenced. What do we mean? That as the nations that traded along the Mediterranean coast would come inland, they would start to influence the people that lived there. Of course, they would come in to trade. They would get to know each other. They would make money from each other, and they needed each other because everybody has something that you don't have that you want to sell and trade for. So business and commerce was the machinery of cultural change. Okay? But as the foreigners came inland into the heart of the country, which corresponds to Kiryat Gat, and then north to Beit Shemesh, then finally to Jerusalem, the holy city, the Jews start getting different. They start looking a little differently at the Greek presence. And after the Greeks, after Alexander, who was a Macedonian from his root, and he took over and unified and took over the Greek world, there came the Ptolemies, which were a reign of kings that were also powerful in Greece as well as connected in Egypt. Then there was the Seleucids, another series of kings. That's never one, it's many, because we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years, and these guys didn't live as long as we did. I think the average age span back then, I think, was around 55 years. And today it's like 85 years. But nonetheless, understand that as the nations came in, they brought their language, they brought their goods, they brought their daughters, their servants. Let's call them servants, not slaves, but because they were more really servants than slaves. And they brought them inward, and they would mix. And the Jews many of the Jews really wanted the outside contact. Okay, and so we see that there was a positive interface in the beginning. And this, if you notice, is often the way cultures do integrate and commingle in the beginning. Because people want to do business and get along. But what happens with the Jews over and over is that they become more and more powerful in the foreign culture. And then in this particular period, Jews started to get the ability to travel to Europe, to travel to Asia Minor, to travel to Africa more and more, and through boats and through caravans. And so what happened was the Jews would go out and say, I can make a lot more money in Athens than I can in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is this small town, really. It's called a city, but it's not a very large city back 200 BC. 100, like I said, 100,000 less than that people, depending on the actual, there's arguments by the historians about how much exactly, obviously, how precise could the numbers be, but they give us an idea. But many Jews wanted to go out to Athens or go to Alexandria. It was another massive business trading center, and the Jews wanted to make a dime, and so they went out and they did. And they oftentimes became so powerful in those cultures, they would get appointed to the court because they had more knowledge than a lot of the other nations around them. And the king always likes to have the smartest people in the country by him, right? So the Jews were oftentimes very welcome in the courts, and they would tell their stories, and they would give over their wisdom. And everybody wants to know about the one God, at least from a distance. Who is this Moses guy? What is this Bible of yours? Tell us about that. I remember that as a kid, people would ask me about the Bible and Moses, and I didn't have much of an answer because I didn't get much of an education. So there was a little bit of embarrassment back then in the teenage years, but okay, we got over it. Now, however, what happens is those Jews, when they get rooted in these foreign cultures, they become more powerful, and they become actually more powerful than the original members of that parent, or I should say that host culture. And people become envious, and people get angry, and people get jealous. And you know what happens after that? There's a rebellion amongst the host nation. And the host nation gets people that don't like the Jews so much in power. And then there's the people that don't mind them because they're making money with them. See, so there's a cultural aspect, is where you stand on the economic ladder will affect your view of the Jew, whoever you are. And this is what happened. So the pattern, again, that we're describing is how things are pretty good in the beginning of most exiles. And we don't even want to call it an exile. Let's call it dispersion, which is, in the fancy word, diaspora, right? Where the Jews are now moving out into the world after the destruction of the first temple. And then they rebuild the second temple, but there's still Jews all over the world. And so they're mixing, and here comes somebody like, as powerful and as well, he was legendary as Alexander, and people wanted to follow his lead. If you send your son off to his army, if he changes his name to a Greek name, if he goes out to fight for the foreign culture, what are you going to do? Fight your son? split apart the family. No, you're going to try to make peace and find a way to work it out. And I think this took a long time. And this took, decades and centuries to play itself out. But what happened was when they got to Jerusalem, they met a new kind of Jew, a zealot Jew, a Jew that was more religious, more profoundly attached to the central life of the nation, which is the temple. The temple has always been the center of life, not Hollywood and not New Orleans and not New York. And in Israel, we don't have a cultural center as our spiritual center. The two don't work together too well. Jerusalem was always the center of the culture because of the temple. And the temple service was revered. And people would come to Jerusalem, they wouldn't even enter the city unless they went to immerse in a mikveh and change their clothes. And they would walk differently even. And so Jerusalem was something else. And when the Greeks and all the other nations would come to Jerusalem, it was like, okay, now you guys, we have new rules. And all the host nations didn't like all the rules. Certainly Nebuchadnezzar didn't when he destroyed the whole country, but the temple and Jerusalem. And then after him, the other kings and generals that came after him also, there was a friction between the business aspect of society and the religious aspect of society. Now that doesn't sound so difficult for us, right? You ever heard of the concept of separation of church and state? State being politics. But who are the politicians working with all the time? Is the business people. And the religious people, well, they're in their corner, they're in their temples, they're in their churches. Let's keep them there. Let's not let them interface, because when they do, there's sparks, there's friction, there's rules that businessmen don't want to abide by. What, I have to give 10% of my crops to your priests? What, I have to give away every 10th animal? Come on already here. What is this? I understand the government needs to tax to run an army, because that's what governments generally do. That's what the bulk of most budgets go to, is the defense budget of any country. And then all of a sudden the Jews come along and say, no, a big chunk of money has to come to Jerusalem to keep the priests, the Kohanim and the Leviim operating and working. So this creates part of the friction. Of course, there's other cultural factors that come into play, like the mixing of men and women, like purity and impurity in terms of food, in terms of clothes, in terms of the cycles of women, etc. All of this is foreign to most of the nations. I would say all the nations, but some have little pieces of it. You'll find tribes in Africa that practice separation during a woman's menstrual cycle. And so, but the basic picture that we're looking at here is we get along with our guests and our hosts until it gets too tight, until it gets too close. And if you look at the history of all other occupations, as they're called, right? And I guess they call it colonialism in the Western textbooks. It's such a nice word, colonial. Like, what is colonial? Well, it stands for colony. We're going to take you, a country, and make you a colony of us. How does that feel? Does that feel good? Florida, Daniel, is now a colony of Spain. We're taking her back. Sure. Well, this is how it operated back then. And remember also, they were traveling slow and information was moving slow. So everything happened slower than we even can comprehend. However, what we notice is that the features of the transformation in the Hanukkah story are very familiar to us today. For example, they had festivals of their own. They had festivals to their own gods, their own types of dancing. They had their own types of music. They had their own types of art shows. Now, a secular Jew, a Hellenized Jew, who already took a Greek name and he took a Greek sword and he goes out on a Greek ship to go off to battle somewhere, He's not going to care so much about the Greek culture that's moving into getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. But his brother who works in the Beit HaMikdash is going to care a lot. And he's not going to want that mixing. So you see, it's in the details that you see where the problems begin. Now, what we also find, and I'm reading a lot of this from some history books by George Adam Smith, and non-Jewish authors, historians that spent their lives studying these things, and it's an interesting take. And there are other ones, Josephus, but they all bring Josephus, right, who is probably the most famous recorder of the ancient era. So just if you want to look these things up. But what we see is, even today, and you see it in America, and you see it in China, and you see it in Russia, and you see it in all these countries that are under attack in their own cultures, we see a splitting, a polarization of the society between factions. The wealthy and the poor has always been a faction, differential. But here we're talking about things like the difference between how religious you are and where you work and if you serve in the army or not, whether you live in Jerusalem or you live in the outlying villages and towns that have already, and what the Greeks do, they don't just come in with an empty wallet, they show up with big bags of money and they rebuild a village and make a town. But then the town becomes a Greek town de facto. And they did this over and over. And because they had the money and the wealth at the time, they were able to rebuild and build up the society that was here. Because Israel was a very quiet, agrarian culture for the most part before the Greeks got here. Okay, now, what else we see is interesting is language. See, the Jews have always spoken foreign languages, but the Hebrew language was always used in religion and literary studies because our literature is the Bible. We don't study, Charles Dickens and actually people do, but I think you understand what I mean. That the reason why we're called the people of the book is because we have this book and it's written in Hebrew. So Hebrew is our main language. Only until the modern era did Hebrew become the language of discourse. In the last 150 years. Did people start beginning to speak Hebrew on a regular basis and develop a conversational Hebrew? Before that, it was a literary language, just like any other literary language. Go to Rome today and talk to people in Latin and see what how they look at you, right? So this is part of the transformation, is the changing of language. And as the Jews learn more languages, they get more worldly, and they get more influence and power in the outer culture. And so they bring that into the inner culture. And again, we have a setup for another transformation here is, well, are you going to teach your child foreign languages? Now, the Talmud says, cursed is the man who teaches his children foreign languages. Now, that's strong language. That's a strong statement that the rabbis make in the Talmud. Cursed is the man who teaches his kid a few languages so he can get along. At least you have to know how to speak Python and speak Cobalt. Those are already old languages. No, but of course, try not to be too facetious. But you understand that when your child has the power over foreign languages, he becomes a person that is more accessible in other cultures. And that, of course, can make him a lot of money, either in business or in politics. But from a religious point of view, it spreads him out into the world. So when they say cursed, they mean you're setting your son up for a fall. You're setting him up to become Hellenized by teaching him Greek and letting him learn Greek and hanging out with his Greek friends. Because that's really how it happened. Day by day, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, village by village. They slowly migrated into Israel because they were looking to sell their goods and buy new ones. Now, I make it all sound a little bit, fairy tale, Because, of course, it wasn't all fairy tales. And we know that there was unpleasant things happening. But still, in this early stage of Hellenization, it was very positive for a lot of people. They were happy to make more money and happy to get out of the little confines of their little villages and be able to go to foreign places and know people and be able to make business with people and establish contacts in the greater world culture. Until this writer writes that 2,000 years ago, you couldn't find a city there wasn't a Jew. Now, if you said that today, it's not so hard to believe, but then you still had Jews in every country in the world then. And so this, let's step back a minute. Let's not take a position. And I got a big white beard here, but I'd like to take a middle ground here because the very religious people have the same position about this, and the very secular people have the same position on their side, is that you do what you want to do. The secular people are just accept no boundaries, and the religious people have all the boundaries because the Torah provides us with halachot, with laws and boundaries. But let's step back and try to take a middle ground, because history has proven itself. History has shown us that there is never an absolute perfection. Maybe in the world to come, maybe when the Messiah already gets here and everything is restored to the level of Gan Eden before the sin, well, we're looking for that day to happen. But until it happens, we're in this reality. And this reality shows that there's always a mixing of good and evil. And what did Adam and Eve eat from? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See, so the knowledge of good and evil is woven into our psyche. And our job is to make a separation between the two. And the ultimate tikkun of the Jew is to be able to go out into exile and make a lot of money and come back and be very pious, God-fearing, halakha observant Jew. And not to go out to exile and bring back 4 or 5, non-Jewish wives who are not really interested in Torah lifestyle, who are not going to produce Jewish children. So you see, there's extremes happening, and to find the middle ground is always the path of compromise. But there's certain areas that we can't compromise, and there's certain areas that a foreign culture won't compromise either. And when the Greeks made their laws, no bris milah, no Rosh Chodesh, no Shabbos, they said, okay, the party's over. Hellenization has reached its peak. They're attacking the Torah. That's it. You can show us your fancy urns and your fancy linen garments and your, a new way to make a shish kebab. We're all looking for a new way to make a la esh, right? But when it comes to, they start to mess with the Torah and our everyday religious practice, that's going to the heart of the nation, and that's going to take us right to war in Jerusalem. And that's what happened. So it took a long time, though. We have to understand this. Now, but in the meantime, what happened? Well, when the Jewish people themselves became bipolar, we had the very Orthodox and the very not Orthodox, the Hellenized. And what would happen is that the Hellenized people would offer themselves as service to the Greeks. Now, what better thing if I'm a Greek mayor of a town in a Jewish land, and I have a bunch of spies working for me that are Jews? That makes my job easier. I'll throw the guy a few coins and he'll give me information. And that's what they did. And so that Jew became a spy on his fellow men. And this type of thing created what we want to call a recruitment program. See, and it's still going on today. If you look on the title page of the Shabak or the Mossad, what's the front page of those highly organized, highly specialized, professional espionage organizations? What's the first page on their book? Type it in online. It's a job application. We want you, right? Why do they want us? Because they want access to information like everybody else. Information is power, especially today, especially inside information. So even back then, though, we had the same ideas happening, that powerful leaders would look for inroads into the culture to get information on what's going on the other side of the temple wall. What's going on with those Kohanim and those Levi'im? Why are they still practicing their bris milas and they're keeping their Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh? They're not listening to our laws. No, right? And so then what happens, they create more separation between the religious and the non-religious, because we see that you can't just talk to your not religious brother-in-law because he might be working for somebody else. And in this recruitment, what's being offered? What's being offered when you become a spy? You're getting paid to become an influencer in a culture. An influencer. And somebody else is calling the shots of what you influence. Understand? If you get a call from Google or Facebook or anybody else that says, we want to make you a star, you better think twice, 3 times, 5 times about that offer, because you have a popularity following on YouTube. Now you see it today. Where do you see it mostly? On these little radio stations and news outlets that suddenly change their platforms because they've been bought out by big media. Interesting. The big media buys them out. The guys who started are very happy to walk with 5 or 10 million and give up the radio or the media business. And suddenly your favorite local news outlet now is putting out different news. That's called buying influence. Okay? And that's going on today, and it was going on then as well. Especially around Jerusalem, especially between the Kohanim and the Levi'im and the Amcha, the greater numbers of Jews that lived outside the Jerusalem area. Okay, with all of that, where do we go? Well, where we're going to go is we're going to go to sleep soon because we got to get up and head down to the Ma'ara. Machpelah in Hebron and learn Kabbalah. But the Kabbalah of this, I'd like to end with this, and tomorrow we're going to pick it up more because it gets darker, I'm afraid. This intermixing of cultures, it gets much darker. And we'll talk about that tomorrow night. But I want to end with this because the Arizal HaKadosh, the greatest Kabbalist of the last 1,000, maybe 2,000 years, he says that the whole reason that the vessels broke in the beginning of creation is because the power centers in our soul did not share. In other words, we're created with 10 power centers that share information with each other. Your head speaks to your heart. Your heart speaks to your head. And by the way, your head speaks to your kidneys and your lungs and your liver and every part of you speaks to every part of you. Understand that claw in Kabbalah. And that information enables you to be an integrated person, which is a very high level when you have that much contact with all the parts of you. You know you're sick before the doctor does, and you know what it is too. Anyways, so that's what we call Olam HaTikun, when man is fixing the fact that we didn't share information with ourselves in the beginning. The parts of the soul didn't share information in the beginning, and they broke. The parts of Am Yisrael did not share information, and they broke at the time of Joseph and the brothers. When they sold Joseph into slavery, Reuben didn't want it to happen. Judah also was not so happy about it, but he was trying to work out a compromise. They weren't communicating, and they weren't communicating with their father. So you see, the general principle is communication fixes problems in life. And lack of communication leads to destruction. And that happened in the beginning of the creation of the world, when everything was in God's hands. And it happens today in every aspect of our lives, in our families, in our communities. When we don't communicate, we lose. And it happened in the time of Joseph and the brothers, and it happened in the time of the Hellenists, the Hellenist Jews wishing they were Greeks, and the religious Jews wanting to keep the Torah the way it's supposed to be. And so the lack of communication and the false communication created the destruction that would follow. Of course, the victory came at the end of the story. We'll get there. We still have 4 more nights of Hanukkah, thank God. So we've still got work to do. But I invite you to come back. I hope to be here around this time tomorrow. I don't know wherever you are, what time it is there. But, it is after the candle lighting and some time with the family, it's a great time to open up the books and look inside and see what's happening, because that's what Torah is. It's the old news that's becoming the new news. God bless you all. Have a great evening. Hanukkah Sameach, and we'll see you tomorrow.